The cave had already taken 7 Marines. 7 men who entered the darkness and never came back out, their screams echoing through limestone tunnels before falling silent. Their bodies somewhere in that black maze where Japanese defenders waited with machine guns and grenades and the infinite patience of men who knew they would never leave the island alive. Grenades didn't work because the tunnels curved and twisted, absorbing the blast, turning shrapnel into harmless metal rain that pattered against stone walls. Rifles didn't matter because you couldn't see what you were shooting at, couldn't aim at muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared like fireflies in the suffocating darkness. Even flamethrowers, America's most feared island war weapon, the thing that made Japanese soldiers scream and run and sometimes choose suicide over burning, couldn't push fire more than a few feet inside before the flames collapsed on themselves, smothered by the cave's dead air and the physics of pressure systems that nobody on Peleliu understood or cared about because understanding physics doesn't matter when your friends are dying. But then a 19-year-old corporal named Alan Smokey Harris, a kid from Oklahoma who'd pumped gas at his uncle's station before the war, who barely passed flamethrower training, who was so scared his hands shook every time he strapped on the 70-pound weapon system that could cook him alive if a bullet pierced the fuel tanks, flipped his M2 flamethrower completely upside down, whispered, "This is stupid," to nobody in particular, and accidentally discovered a physics trick that every Marine engineer and every Navy scientist and every weapons developer back in the States had somehow missed. For the next 42 seconds, that cave wasn't a fortress, it was a furnace, and what happened inside changed how Marines fought Japanese cave defenses for the rest of the Pacific War. Though most history books never mention Harris's name and the official Marine Corps manual never acknowledged that sometimes the best innovations come from terrified teenagers who break the rules because following them means watching more of their friends die. The island of Peleliu in September 1944 was hell sculpted from coral and volcanic rock. A nightmare landscape where every ridge hid caves, every cave hid soldiers, and every soldier had orders to never surrender, to sell their lives as expensively as possible, to turn American victory into American slaughter. The terrain defied description. Jagged limestone formations that tore through boot leather, coral outcroppings sharp enough to slice hands when you dove for cover, and a heat so intense that men hallucinated, that metal became too hot to touch, that the air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolence. The smell was worse than the heat. Sulfur from volcanic vents mixing with the sweet-rot stench of bodies decomposing in the tropical sun, with cordite smoke, with the acrid burn of flamethrower fuel, creating an atmosphere that made men vomit even when they hadn't been wounded. The Japanese had turned the island's natural cave systems into interconnected fortresses. Tunnels connecting to tunnels, chambers opening into chambers, firing ports cut at angles that let defenders shoot while remaining invisible, ventilation shafts that drew away smoke and brought in fresh air, storage rooms stocked with ammunition and water, and the grim determination to never retreat. Every approach to these caves was a kill zone. Marines had to cross open ground under fire, climb coral formations that offered no cover, expose themselves completely to reach cave mouths that breathed machine gun fire and grenade explosions. Standard tactics didn't work. You couldn't flank a cave, couldn't suppress fire from a position you couldn't see, couldn't call in artillery that would just collapse the entrance and trap the defenders inside where they'd wait for you to try clearing the rubble. Marines tried everything. They threw grenades that rolled back out before exploding or detonated harmlessly around tunnel corners. They sent engineers with TNT satchel charges who got shot before they could place the explosives. They used smoke grenades to blind the defenders, but the cave systems had natural ventilation that cleared the smoke in seconds. They even tried talking the Japanese into surrendering, though everyone knew that was pointless because these soldiers had been told. Americans would torture and kill prisoners, had been ordered to fight to the death, had been transformed by military indoctrination into men who saw surrender as worse than any death. The commanders labeled one particular cave complex Black Tunnel 6, a bureaucratic designation that became a curse word among the Marines who had to assault the ridgeline where it sat. A cave that had swallowed 7 men in 3 days, that overlooked critical supply routes, that couldn't be bypassed because the Japanese inside could shoot at anything moving below, that couldn't be ignored but seemingly couldn't be cleared. Corporal Alan Harris never wanted to be a flamethrower operator. In training, he'd requested rifle duty, mortar crew, anything except the weapon that turned you into a priority target wearing 70 pounds of explosive fuel. But the Marine Corps didn't care what you wanted, and Harris had steady hands and a mechanical aptitude from years of working on engines and fuel systems at his uncle's gas station. So they strapped the M2 flamethrower to his back and taught him how to shoot liquid fire, how to maintain fuel pressure, how to clear the ignition coil, how to die quickly if a bullet hit the tanks because that was more merciful than burning. He was 19 years old, skinny even by Marine standards, with hands that never quite stopped shaking after his first combat experience when he'd fired the flamethrower into a pillbox and heard men screaming inside. Heard them dying in the way that flamethrowers killed. Not always from the fire itself but from the oxygen being sucked out of enclosed spaces, from lungs searing in superheated air, from the psychological horror of burning alive. Harris had nightmares about those screams. Woke up gasping. Wondered if the men he'd killed had families who would receive letters saying their son or husband or father had died in combat. Letters that wouldn't mention he'd been burned alive by a teenager from Oklahoma who pumped gas for a living. But Harris kept doing his job because his friends were dying, because refusing to use the flamethrower meant other Marines would have to. Because in war you don't get to keep your hands clean no matter how much you want to. When they told him his unit was assaulting Black Tunnel 6, Harris felt his stomach drop, felt the familiar cold sweat starting, felt the weight of the flamethrower on his back become almost unbearable because he knew, everyone knew, that this cave ate men. The fundamental problem with flamethrowers in cave warfare was physics, though nobody explained it that way, they just knew the damn things didn't work right in tunnels. The M2 flamethrower operated on a pressure system. Compressed nitrogen forced thickened fuel through a nozzle where an electrically ignited spark set it burning, creating a stream of fire that could reach 30 feet in open air, that could burn through wooden fortifications, that could pour into windows and gun ports and turn defensive positions into crematoriums. But caves weren't open air, they were enclosed spaces with complex airflow. Patterns, with back pressure created by the fire itself, with dead zones where oxygen levels dropped so low that flames couldn't sustain combustion. When you fired a flamethrower into a tunnel, the burning fuel would shoot forward maybe 10 or 15 feet before the pressure differential pushed back, before the fire started collapsing on itself like a wave breaking against a seawall, before the entire flame stream would curl backwards toward you carrying superheated air and smoke and the terrifying possibility that you were about to be burned by your own weapon. The Japanese knew this, their engineers had tested captured flamethrowers, had designed their tunnel systems specifically to defeat this American weapon, had created chambers where the tunnels curved just beyond the effective flame range, where defenders could wait in safety while Marines exposed themselves at cave entrances trying to push fire into spaces that physics made unreachable. Harris learned this the hard way during his first attempt on Black Tunnel 6, when his lieutenant ordered him forward with 2 riflemen for cover, when he belly-crawled across coral that shredded his uniform and tore his skin, when he finally reached the cave mouth and aimed the wand, the long pipe that sprayed the burning fuel, into the darkness. He pressed the trigger, felt the familiar kick of ignition, saw the flame burst forward in a brilliant orange-yellow stream that roared like a freight train and illuminated the tunnel entrance for exactly 5 seconds before it sputtered, wavered, and collapsed back toward him. Harris rolled away instinctively, the backwash of heat scorching his exposed neck, and then the Japanese machine gun opened up from somewhere deep in the tunnel, bullets sparking off rocks where Harris had been lying 2 seconds earlier, where he would have died if he'd stayed to watch his flamethrower fail. He crawled back to his lines shaking, the flamethrower tanks clanging against his back, his face blackened with smoke and his hands bleeding from the coral and his mind screaming that this was impossible, that no weapon they had could clear this cave, that more Marines were going to die trying to do the impossible because command didn't understand that you can't burn what you can't reach. The accident happened during repositioning when Harris's squad was trying to find a better angle of approach, when they were moving along the ridgeline under sporadic rifle fire, when Harris was carrying the flamethrower at an awkward angle because the straps had loosened and the weight distribution was wrong. A Japanese grenade landed 5 feet away. Somebody shouted, "Down!" Though Harris never knew who, and he dove for cover without thinking, hitting the coral hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs, landing in a natural depression with the M2 flamethrower twisted beneath him. Tanks angled downward, wand pointing up and backward in a position that every training manual said was dangerous, that violated every safety protocol, that could theoretically cause fuel system damage or ignition problems, or a dozen other mechanical failures. Harris lay there gasping, waiting for the grenade's blast, but it was a dud or someone had kicked it away because nothing exploded, and as he pushed himself up his finger accidentally hit the trigger. Just a brief contact, barely half a second, and the flamethrower discharged in a way it had never fired before. The flame shot out in a narrow, concentrated jet that looked nothing like the normal wide spray pattern. A stream of fire so focused it looked like molten metal being poured from a crucible, and it reached at least 40 feet before dissipating. Maybe more, Harris couldn't tell because he was too shocked to measure accurately. The flame was different, hotter, brighter, moving faster, like the difference between a garden hose and a pressure washer. Harris stared at the wand in his hands, at the tanks on his back, trying to understand what had just happened, and then he realized. The flamethrower had been upside down, inverted, the tanks angled so gravity forced the thickened fuel toward what was normally the top of the system but was now the bottom, which meant the fuel was collecting at the intake valve under pressure from both the nitrogen system and gravity itself, which meant, and Harris understood this from years of working with fuel systems and pressure lines, that the mixture being pushed through the nozzle was denser, under higher pressure, moving faster, burning hotter because the fuel-to-air ratio had changed. It was accidental physics, improvised engineering that happened because a Marine dove for cover in the wrong position and touched the trigger at the wrong moment, and for a few seconds Harris just lay there thinking that wasn't supposed to happen, before his training sergeant's voice echoed in his memory. If you find something that works, kid, you do it again until it stops working. Harris crawled back to his squad leader, a sergeant from Detroit who'd seen enough combat to know when something unusual had just occurred, and between gasping breaths explained what happened, demonstrated the angle, showed how the tanks had been inverted when the flame shot further than any flamethrower burst the sergeant had ever seen. The sergeant stared at Harris like he was insane, like he was proposing they all eat grenades for breakfast, but then the sergeant looked at Black Tunnel 6 and at the bodies of Marines who hadn't come back and at the tactical situation that demanded somebody clear that cave or the entire assault would stall, and the sergeant made the calculation that desperate times called for desperate measures, that orthodox tactics weren't working, that maybe a 19-year-old kid with a crazy idea deserved one chance to prove he wasn't completely crazy. Kid, the sergeant said, his voice rough from shouting orders and breathing coral dust. Can you do that upside-down thing on purpose? Can you control it? Harris wanted to say no, wanted to explain that he had no idea if it would work again, that one accidental discharge didn't prove anything, that he might just burn himself and waste fuel and accomplish nothing except making himself look like a fool before he died. But he looked at the cave entrance, thought about the 7 Marines already dead, thought about how many more would die if they couldn't clear this position, and he heard himself saying, yeah, I can do it, even though he wasn't sure, even though he was terrified, even though every instinct screamed that this plan was stupid and dangerous and would probably fail. The sergeant nodded once. Just that. No pep talk, no dramatic speech, just a nod that meant, okay, we're trying this, and began positioning riflemen to provide covering fire while Harris prepared to do something that no Marine flamethrower operator had ever attempted in combat. Harris rotated the M2 flamethrower on his back, struggling with the 70-pound weight, feeling the strap strain and dig into his shoulders, hearing the fuel slosh inside the tanks with a sound that reminded him of gasoline cans sloshing in his uncle's truck bed. Except these cans were strapped to his body and filled with jellied fuel that would turn him into a human torch if anything went wrong. The tanks hummed slightly, that was the nitrogen pressure system maintaining its charge, and Harris adjusted the wand to point downward while the fuel tanks pointed up, creating the inverted configuration that physics said should increase pressure and flame concentration but that common sense said would probably get him killed. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely grip the wand properly, sweat running into his eyes despite the fear cold that made his skin feel clammy, and he had to wipe his palms on his already filthy uniform before he could trust himself to crawl forward. The riflemen moved with him, 3 Marines who would cover his approach, who would shoot at anything that moved in the cave entrance, who would try to keep him alive long enough to attempt his insane plan, and Harris focused on breathing, on moving forward one coral-cutting knee at a time, on not thinking about what would happen if this didn't work. If the flamethrower just produced a normal burst that would alert the Japanese to his position without actually reaching them, if he ended up dying. In exactly the same place other flamethrower operators had died trying the same futile assault with conventional tactics. The cave entrance grew larger as Harris approached, a black mouth that seemed to swallow light, and he could smell the distinctive odor of Japanese defensive positions. A mixture of gunpowder, human waste, stale air, and something else. Something that might have been fear or determination or the particular scent of men who knew they were going to die but had decided to take as many enemies with them as possible. Harris positioned himself 15 feet from the entrance, closer than any previous attempt because he needed to maximize the flame reach, close enough that he could hear voices inside. Japanese soldiers talking in low tones, probably preparing for another assault, probably wondering why the Americans kept trying the same failed tactics. The wand felt awkward in his inverted grip, the weight distribution all wrong, the angle requiring him to brace his body in a position that left him completely exposed, But Harris bit down on his own sleeve to stop his jaw from shaking and thought about the 7 Marines who died in this cave and about all the other Marines who would die if nobody figured out how to clear these Japanese positions, and he positioned his thumb over the trigger while the ignition coil began to glow with building electrical charge. The sergeant gave the signal, one quick hand gesture that meant now, and the riflemen opened fire at the cave entrance, their bullets ricocheting off stone, creating noise and distraction, and Harris pressed the trigger while hanging upside down from his own flamethrower in a position that would have gotten him punished in training, but that now became the only thing that mattered. The flame erupted from the wand in a concentrated jet that looked nothing like the standard flamethrower burst. This was a spear of fire, a lance of burning fuel that shot into the cave entrance and kept going, penetrating 20 feet, 25, 30 feet into the darkness, reaching depths that should have been impossible, that were impossible with conventional flame projection. The stream was narrow, maybe 2 feet wide instead of the normal 5 or 6, but that concentration made it hotter, made it faster, made it capable of reaching around the tunnel's first curve and finding the defenders who thought they were safe beyond the effective range of American weapons. Harris held the trigger down, emptying the fuel tanks in one continuous burst that lasted 42 seconds. He counted them afterward, counted every second while the cave roared with combustion, while the temperature inside spiked to levels that made air itself explosive, while Japanese soldiers began screaming as their positions turned into a blast furnace. The physics of enclosed space combustion created a feedback effect. The initial flame heated the air, the heated air expanded violently. The expansion created pressure waves that pushed deeper into the tunnel system carrying superheated gases. The gases ignited everything combustible: ammunition, supplies, wooden support beams, and the entire cave network became a self-sustaining fire that fed on its own oxygen consumption and temperature increase. The sound was ungodly. A continuous roar like standing next to a jet engine mixed with the crack of exploding ammunition and the screams of men who had nowhere to run. No escape from the fire that had reached them in positions they thought were untouchable. Harris kept the trigger pressed even as his arms burned from the awkward angle, even as the backblast heat made his face feel like it was sunburning in real time, even as smoke and steam poured from the cave entrance in a scalding cloud, because he knew, somehow knew with certainty, that this was working in a way nothing else had worked, that he was doing something nobody had done before, that Black Tunnel 6 was finally dying. When the fuel tanks emptied, Harris released the trigger and collapsed, rolling away from the cave entrance on instinct, his body moving while his brain shut down from sensory overload and fear exhaustion. The flamethrower tanks were scorching hot against his back, the metal radiating heat like a furnace, and he tore at the straps to get the weapon off before it burned through his uniform to his skin. Behind him, Marines stood in shocked silence, staring at the cave entrance where smoke poured out like the mountain was exhaling, where the stone itself glowed faintly orange from internal heat, where nothing living could possibly remain. The sergeant was the first to move, signaling for the riflemen to approach cautiously, to check the entrance, to verify what everyone already knew but needed to see. The cave was clear, the defenders were dead, Black Tunnel 6 had been neutralized by a method so improvised and unconventional that it shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Harris lay on the coral gasping, his hands blistered from the heat, his face feeling like he'd been too close to a campfire, his mind struggling to process what he'd just done, what he'd just survived, what impossible trick of physics and desperation had turned a failed weapon into a cave-clearing miracle. Engineers moved in hours later, after the cave had cooled enough to enter, after the smoke had cleared and the fires had burned themselves out. They found dozens of weapons inside, rifles, machine guns, grenades, ammunition stores that could have supplied the defenders for weeks, and they found bodies, though not as many as expected because the heat had been so intense that some soldiers had simply been cremated where they stood, reduced to ash and bone fragments. The Japanese had built this position to be impregnable, had designed the tunnels specifically to defeat American tactics, had stocked it with enough supplies to make any siege futile, had manned it with soldiers who would never surrender. None of that mattered against physics accidentally discovered by a terrified 19-year-old who inverted his weapon because he dove for cover wrong. A chaplain blessed the cave, saying words over the entrance that Harris couldn't hear because his ears were still ringing from the flame roar. A lieutenant, a college-educated officer who'd studied engineering before the war, found Harris sitting on a rock cleaning the flamethrower with shaking hands, and the lieutenant just stared at him for a long moment before saying quietly, "Son, you rewrote the manual today. I don't know if command will ever officially acknowledge what you did, But Marines are going to talk about this. Harris didn't know what to say to that. So he said nothing, just kept cleaning the weapon that had saved his life and cost others theirs. Kept thinking about the screams he'd heard from inside the cave. Kept wondering if discovering how to kill more efficiently made him a hero or just a more effective killer. The upside-down flamethrower trick spread through Marine units on Peleliu like wildfire, whispered from unit to unit, demonstrated in relative safety behind the lines, discussed in the informal networks of NCOs and junior officers who understood that official channels moved too slowly to help Marines dying right now. Some engineers tested it systematically, measuring flame distance and temperature, trying to understand exactly why the inverted configuration worked better: gravity-assisted fuel flow, increased pressure differential, altered fuel-to-air mixture ratios, better atomization of the jellied gasoline. Other operators just knew it worked and did it when cave warfare demanded maximum flame penetration, when conventional tactics had failed, when the choice was between trying something crazy or watching more friends die. The technique never made it into official Marine Corps doctrine, never appeared in training manuals, never received formal recognition from command structures that preferred orthodox solutions to improvised field innovations. But it spread anyway, carried by the real communication network that kept Marines alive. The sergeants who'd seen it work, the lieutenants who trusted their NCOs, the flamethrower operators who'd rather violate safety protocols than fail to clear a position. Harris himself survived Peleliu, fought on Okinawa where he used the inverted technique 3 more times, and made it home to Oklahoma after the war ended, where he went back to pumping gas at his uncle's station and never talked about the caves or the fire or the screams. He died in 1987 at age 62, and his obituary in the local paper said he was a Marine veteran who served in the Pacific but gave no details, mentioned no heroism, contained nothing about the day he accidentally discovered that flipping a flamethrower upside down changed the physics enough to turn impossible cave assaults into survivable operations. In a war defined by industrial-scale brutality, where victory was measured in body counts and territorial gains, where technology and firepower and logistical superiority generally determined outcomes, sometimes the decisive factors were smaller and stranger. A 19-year-old who understood fuel pressure from pumping gas, an accidental weapons discharge during a grenade scare, the willingness to try something ridiculous because everything sensible had already failed. The flamethrower was one of World War II's most feared weapons, but it was also deeply flawed, limited by physics and engineering constraints that no amount of testing had overcome. Cave warfare on Pacific Islands exposed those flaws brutally, turning a devastating weapon into something nearly useless against the underground fortresses that Japanese defenders built. The solution didn't come from weapons laboratories or engineering teams or tactical innovations developed by senior officers. It came from a scared kid who dove wrong and noticed something nobody else had noticed, who was desperate enough to try it again deliberately, who survived long enough to prove that sometimes physics favors the improviser. Black Tunnel 6 is gone now. If you visited Peleliu today, you wouldn't find it marked on any map, wouldn't see any memorial acknowledging what happened there, wouldn't know that 7 Marines died there before one figured out how to clear it using a technique that no manual described. The cave itself was probably dynamited and sealed after the battle, or it collapsed naturally over the decades, or it's still there but overgrown and forgotten like so much of that terrible island. But what happened there mattered, shaped how Marines fought similar battles, saved lives in subsequent campaigns, proved that in war the difference between impossible and possible sometimes depends on a teenager being willing to flip his weapon upside down and see what happens. In a war defined by brutality, chance favored the Marine who dared to invert his weapon and point fire where no man could go, who refused to accept that physics made cave clearing impossible, who discovered through accident and desperation that sometimes the most effective innovation is the one nobody planned, nobody tested, and nobody official ever acknowledged. But that worked, that killed the enemy, that saved American lives, and that became legend whispered among the men who actually did the fighting rather than the generals who got credit for the victories.